Hi, I'm Anne and welcome back to my video. Today I'm going to be going through some of my favorite books, aka the best books of the year, and some of my least favorite books, aka the worst books of the year. Not all of these are published in 2020, but a lot of them are, partially by coincidence. So this video will be kind of going back and forth between the worst books and the best books because I don't want it to be super depressing just talking about like the worst books or super happy just talking about the best books. So I'm going to have 5 of my favorite books that I read this year and 5 of my least favorite books that I read this year. So let's get into it. So the first one is Dead Astronauts by Jeff Vandermeer. This book came out at the end of last year. For some reason, I thought it came out at the beginning of this year because that's when I read it. But no, it came out in like December 2019. Now, this is the second book of the Born series. I didn't know that when reading it. It was only after I'd finished the book that I found out that it was in a series and was the second book. And I probably should have read the first book first, but I also feel like I would have had the same problems with the first book that I had with the second book. So this is definitely one of the worst books I read this year. I gave it a 1 star. It was really bad. The best way to describe it is speculative science fiction. So it kind of follows these 3 people on this planet who are kind of exploring the world. That's the best generalization I can give for this plot because it was an absolute mess. So my first biggest problem, and usually the problem I find with a lot of books that I dislike, is I never felt connected to the characters. The writing feels very distant. So we are kind of watching these people go through the world instead of actually experiencing it with them. So I never felt like I understood or got to know the characters. But worst of all the characters felt like they were on psychedelic drugs. Like, this book is trippy. It is very weird. And I know Vandermeer just tends to write these more stylized books, so it may just be his writing just doesn't click with me. But also nothing in this book made sense. The world has little cohesion and there's no idea of like how the rules are. Like, I never felt like I got to understand or learn about the world. Also, the writing is really poetic, but it's so poetic and figurative that it kind of brings down the plot. The way I can encompass my thoughts about this book is it just felt disjointed. That's the best way to describe it. So from a bad book to a good book, the second book I'm going to be talking about is a 5-star read for me, and that is The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. I saw this book coming out at the beginning of the year and I was intrigued by it, so I read it. It was released in February of 2020, and kind of the overarching, I guess, plot of this book is this young woman's aunt vanished while being the night worker at a motel, and the niece in the modern day goes to find out what happened to her aunt in the 80s. And there's some supernatural elements and mystery elements. Now, I know a lot of people have mixed feelings about this book because the supernatural elements don't always fit with the mystery, and it seems, in a sense, to detract from the mystery, but I loved everything about this book. I really loved the mystery and the writing style. It was just perfect to me. It was a quintessential mystery, and I actually didn't mind more of the fantasy supernatural elements. Now, I did recently read another book by Simone St. James, and that was called Silence for the Dead, which kind of follows a nurse who, after World War I, goes to a mental asylum to take care of patients, and it's also a mystery, but it has very similar elements to the Sundown Motel, but it does them not quite as well, because I could definitely see some of the weaknesses in the Sundown Motel that didn't really bother me in that book really bothered me in the Silence for the Dead book. Like, the balance between the mystery and supernatural elements were not as well cohesive in the previous book. But Simone St. James is definitely that author that I really want to read more of. The next book that I gave a 1 star is How Quickly She Disappears, which is a debut novel by this author whose name I will butcher, as I always do, Raymond Fleischman. So this book has been kind of compared to Silence of the Lambs, which is one of my favorite books of all times, which is why when I went into reading it, I thought I would kind of enjoy it. So the best way to describe this plot is there is a woman living in this small town in Alaska. This mysterious man comes to stay in town, murders a person, and he is imprisoned, but he refuses to talk to anyone but the main woman, and he has knowledge of her sister who disappeared years ago. Elizabeth, who's the main character, is just very frustrating. One of the reasons I dislike this book so much is because her character felt so dumb. And that is one of my pet peeves about books, is if the characters feel dumb, I probably won't enjoy it. There's a difference between creating kind of a naive character that experiences hardships and grows into being a less naive character, but with her character, it was so bad. Also, the mystery was really interesting and really good, but at the end, it kind of just fell apart. And I won't get into any spoilers, but the mystery was not satisfactory to me at all. There was really no closure on like the biggest questions. That's the whole point of reading mysteries, is you read them to figure out who is the murderer, what happened to the victim, etc., etc. And none of those questions were answered in this book, and that very much bothered me. It didn't help that this book is, I believe, set in the 40s, so during World War II, and yet it did not feel historical at all. It felt very modern. Going to a much happier read and a better read. This is a 5-star read for me. The Library of Legends by Janie Chung. I loved this book. So it kind of combines history with fantasy, and it did it so perfectly because it weaves in some Chinese mythology, which I love. Just prior to World War II, it is 1937, and there are a group of students who go to college in Nanjing, whatever you want to call it. In this book, I think it's Nanking, but the city has a lot of different pronunciations and transliterations. Japan is bombing Nanking at this time, so these group of students from Minghua University decide to escape with these very old books from this library known as the Library of Legends. So it's kind of books that have to do with Chinese mythology, and each of these students that are escaping has charge of one book. So say there's like 500 books in the library, each student takes one of those books and keeps it on a 1,000-mile walk to this other city where they will be safe. So the entire story kind of encompasses their travels. So there's a large group of students, but we kind of follow just a few. The main character is Hua Lian, and she is 19 years old. The main love interest she has is Liao Xiaoming, and he's kind of like this very wealthy student, whereas she's kind of poor. She got in on a scholarship to the university, and of course there's all these students around them. You're probably listening to this plot and you're like, I see the historical element. Now where's the fantasy? Well, let's just say that there's immortals that are waking up because of the bombing of China, and I won't say more because a lot of it is spoilers, but it is a great story, and there's a few interesting twists at the end, which I will not give away because I loved them and it was so awesome. This is another book that I thought really blended historical accuracy with fantasy just seamlessly. The way that the mythology and the magical elements fit inside the very real and harsh reality of 1930s China was just perfect, and I loved this book. Going from good to bad, we are back to bad, the 1 stars. And the next book is The Wrong Mr Darcy by Evelyn Lozado and Holly Lorenz. So this book came out in August of this year, and obviously by the title, it is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, as you might have seen from my Beauty and the Beast retelling video. I have a thing for retellings. I love retellings, but this one just was so bad. Now, I personally think in order to have a retelling, you have to have some meaningful connection to the original. And that doesn't have to be like, oh, all the details of the plot, all the characters are there. I think you can like kind of have fun with it, but this one felt like it had barely any connection to the original plot outside of, yeah, there's this guy that's a little bit arrogant and he's a football player, and there's this girl who's this reporter and she's kind of prejudiced against him, and they meet and fall in love. Like, that's the only similarity I could see. There's like this friend that she makes that's dating the friend of Darcy and who's kind of like Bingley. He's nothing like Bingley. Like, there is very little comparison to the original novel, and so I felt like I would have enjoyed this book if it hadn't been connected to Pride and Prejudice a little bit more. I still wouldn't have like enjoyed the book because I didn't like it, but I feel like I would have given it at least a 2-star if it hadn't been connected to Pride and Prejudice, because if you're going to connect it to one of my favorite novels of all time, you need to do a better job. Also, it didn't help that everything that was happening felt so shallow and so ridiculous. I kept wanting there to be more of like depth to anything, whether it was the romance or some of the like drama that was going on between the main character Hara and like her father in prison, which is a whole other thing I won't get into, or like Derek Darcy and his father expecting so much of him. I wanted them to get into any deeper elements, and yet it was kind of just like shoved under the rug for like just random romance scenes and like random thriller drama scenes. One of the reasons these books got 1 stars from me is because I saw elements that could have made the book good, because a lot of like stupid romance are just there to be stupid romance. But when you add some meaningful elements and then just ignore them for the entire book, I get a bit upset, because I'm like, there was so much here that you could have built on to make a beautiful, wonderful, moving story, and you just ignored it. Anyway, back to a better review, a 5-star review for me, and that is a book I got from Book Outlet like early this year, right when the virus, which shall not be named, hit. There were major shutdowns, and I was kind of stuck inside my house, so I bought a bunch of books from Book Outlet. One of my favorite ones I got that I've read so far is Outrun the Moon by Stacey Lee. She's an author I definitely want to read more, because I read this book and I absolutely loved it. So this book basically follows this young girl in San Francisco. She kind of wheedles her way into blackmailing this principal of this important girls' school to get into this almost exclusively white girls' school. And she lives in Chinatown. She is the daughter of Chinese immigrants, so they're pretty poor. This book discusses some of the racism that was going on against Asians during that time, which I thought was very interesting. But so she kind of makes friends with some of these girls, makes some enemies as she goes to this school, and then the San Francisco earthquake hits in 1906. Now, Mary Wong, who's the main character, she is such a brilliant character. I loved her character. She has this perfect combination of like strength but also vulnerability, which I think every great character should have. They shouldn't be a completely weak, pointless character, but they shouldn't be this like perfect idealized character, and she balances that perfectly. I loved all the girls, the friendships that she made throughout the book. No spoilers, but some of the plot twists were really great. This book contains this perfect balance between strife and victory. I find that there are certain books that kind of play up the hopelessness and like there's nothing we can do, the world's horrible, blah blah blah, and it's very depressing to read those types of books, and I don't like them that much. But then there's other books that play it the opposite way, like, oh, there's like so easy victory without any strife. And I thought this book achieved a combination of the two perfectly. Now, this was published in 2015, so not this year, but I'm not even sure if it's on Book Outlet anymore, but it was a great book and I highly recommend it. And I definitely want to read more of Stacey Lee's books. So the next 1-star review. I feel kind of bad giving this 1 star because this author seems to be extremely popular. And that is Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter. This book was published in 2015, and Claire's sister vanished years ago, and suddenly this other girl vanished, and it's kind of a similar case, and so she dives into trying to figure out what happened to her sister. That's the best way I can describe this book without giving spoilers away, because obviously it's a thriller. Karen Slaughter is a massive author. I see her books almost everywhere. She's been on my list to read for a long time, but I heard that Pretty Girls was not only like her most popular book, but one of her best books, which is why I picked it up. And I feel bad because I only gave it 1 star. I ended up DNFing this book halfway through, which usually I do not do reviews for books that I haven't finished, because especially if I read like 2 chapters and I'm just not in the mood, it's not fair for me to give like a negative review for that book because I could have ended up loving it. So first of all, this book is really hard to get into, just the very beginning, because it switches perspectives and there's also like different timelines that are going on. In the beginning, I liked that it had a lot of realism. It showed like the real trauma that people go through when different tragedies hit. But it didn't help that by 1/4 of the way into the book, it started to lack realism at all. It made no sense to me. It was just like throwing out more drama and more thrilling things. And I was like, okay, cool it, calm down. It's okay, we don't need this many twists. The twists are supposed to come at the end of the book. Claire and Lydia's the second main character, kind of. They were introduced kind of as being interesting, but as the story progressed, they never developed out of like that first initial generalized development. So they felt stereotyped, is what I'm trying to say. I also didn't like how like every man in this book is made to be bad. Even those that you think are good in the beginning just eventually become bad. Like the police are really bad. Pretty much all the men connected to Elizabeth and Lydia, I'm gonna say pretty much, they're all psychopaths and maniacs. It also didn't help that I kept like guessing all the plot twists at least a couple chapters before it actually revealed anything, and then I was hoping that twist would not be as predictable, but it was. I even jumped to the end of the book to see if I was right about the murderer before I actually DNF'd it, and yes, I was correct about the murderer. The next book that I gave 5 stars, back to, good books, and that is Marley and Me by Josh Grogan. Now, this book was published a long time ago. I know, it's 2005. This book blew up. There was a movie for it. There's like a whole book series for kids that is around the life of Marley. So if you didn't know this story, and I feel like most people know this story, it's about this very difficult golden retriever that Josh, the author, and his family adopted, and the entire book kind of follows the life of Marley. Not only is it well written, not only is it cute because it's the life of a dog. Like, yes, there's going to be like great and happy moments, and yes, there's going to be sad moments. Spoilers for the ending. But what I loved about this book is just how well the narrative built on each other. Like, most of the plot just follows the timeline of Marley's life, but the way that Grogan weaves in different smaller stories and kind of has them build to be something meaningful was just so perfectly done. So on a more, I guess, writer level, it was great, and on a more enjoyment cutesy level, it was also great. So yes, I enjoyed this book. And the final like bad book of the year, which I actually gave 2 stars, is not quite as bad as a lot of the other ones, but I was just mostly disappointed in that, and that is The Boy from the Woods by Harlan Coben. Now, I have read another book by Coben years ago, The Innocent, and it was about a man that was tried for a crime he didn't commit. I remember enjoying it. In fact, I used to own that book, but I think I got rid of it years ago. So this book follows Wild, a man that when he was a child was discovered in the woods, living feral, and he has no memory of his past. And then in the present day, where he's like an adult, there is this girl that goes missing, and he kind of starts to help find her. I feel like I'm going to get into spoilers if I say anything more, so I'm just going to like leave it at that. I was really intrigued with a lot of the elements in this book, and I was kind of pulled into the story immediately. Like, I love the elements of like, there's this missing girl, there's this boy in the forest, there's this like a government corruption type stuff going on. But I also felt like none of the stakes felt high for how high I feel like they should have been. I just didn't feel like a lot of the things were taken that Seriously. Every time that the conflict would start to rise and I'd be like, ooh, I'm interested, there would be like a plot twist that would just diffuse the situation completely, and I'd be like, oh, okay. I thought the mystery was just starting. There were also so many side plots. I was just overwhelmed with side plots, like Hester's romance. Hester was one of the characters that was like a friend of Wilde when he was younger, and it's her daughter who vanishes. I will say the ending was decent, which is the main reason I ended up giving this book 2 stars instead of 1 star, because the ending was very well done. But the entire book building up to it was not worth reading just for a good ending. The final 5-star read is a book I reviewed just last week on my channel, and that is The Hen Who Dreamed She Could Fly by Sun Mi Huan. Now, I did like a full detailed review on the plot of this, but it kind of follows a hen who wants to lay an egg and become a mother, and she breaks out of her pen to escape, and she finds an egg and nests on it, and a duck hatches, and she raises it to be her own child. And it's a serious story, but also super sweet. It's that type of book that brings very complex ideas down to a very simple level, and it was just perfect. I love that book. Are there any of these books that you've read and you've either shared my opinions or completely disagreed? I'd love to know, especially if like one of the books I really didn't like you loved, and one of the books that I absolutely loved you didn't like. And I'd love to see like how we differ on what you think of the books. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, leave a like and comment about your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you can be notified when I post. I post every Saturdays at 6 p.m. and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!